In the last video, we talked about finding the vertex of a quadratic, which was one of the two important parts of a quadratic. And in this video, we're going to talk about finding the intercepts, which is the other important part. All right, so there's two types of intercepts, x and y-intercepts. In this first part, we're going to talk about y-intercepts. All right, so the y-intercepts where we cross the y-axis, and we talked about this in an earlier unit. That happens when your x value is 0. All right, so when we're finding a y value, the kind of simplest way to put it is you plug in 0, and then you just simplify as much as possible. All right, so we're going to find the y-intercept for this equation. All right, this one's in standard form, and this is actually the simplest one. If I want to find it, I plug in 0. These terms that have 0 are just going to go away because multiplying by 0 disappears, and I just get 2. This should be f of 0. All right, so my y-intercept is at y equals 2. All right, so again, just plugging in 0, following the order of operations to simplify. All right, in this one, we're still trying to find a y-intercept, but now it's in vertex form. All right, again, same thing. I'm going to plug in 0 for my x value. All right, but this one's actually going to require a little bit of simplifying and following the order of operations. So order of operations, remember, parentheses happens first. So I do 0 minus 2 is negative 2. All right, the biggest mistake students will make is in this next step, they would multiply negative 3 times negative 2. And remember, parentheses, exponents is the second part of order of operations. So the second thing I'm going to do is this exponent. So the negative 3 is going to stay. Negative 2 squared is positive 4. And now I can do multiplication. Negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. And then I only have one thing left, the addition. Negative 12 plus 5 is negative 7. Right, so that's our final answer, negative 7. All right, the only difference here, still the same setup, just plugging in 0. But you have to be a lot more careful with your order of operations when you started in vertex form versus standard form. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. I found the y-intercept of this quadratic. And the solution I got was 14. So again, plug in 0. First thing you do is that exponent. 3 squared is 9. 9 times 2 is 18. Minus 4 is 14. All right, so our other type of intercept is x-intercepts. These are the ones that require a bit more work. Again, just to start off, if you have an x-intercept, that means your y value is 0. And the actual process of finding x-intercept is you set your equation equal to 0, and then you have to solve. And solving quadratics is what our entire Unit 4 was about. So basically you have to use all your skills from Unit 4 in this one part of this unit. All right, so just a quick recap of Unit 4. All right, there are 3 main ways that we use to solve quadratics. All right, the first way we learned was factoring. All right, so if you can break down your quadratic into smaller factors, that makes the equation a bit simpler. All right, the second way we learned was using square roots. All right, so if you can take the square root of a perfect square, then you can do that. It makes the problem simpler. And then the last way we use is the best one because it always works, but it does require a lot of simplifying and you having the formula memorized, right, which you should, is the quadratic formula. All right, so you can use any of these options when you're solving your quadratics, but I'll kind of give you an explanation of which one I think is best in each case, right? Because kind of picking the right method is going to have the least amount of steps, and that'll mean the least amount of options for making a mistake. So they all work, but sometimes one is better than the other. All right, so let's find the x-intercepts for this quadratic. Again, the very first step, whenever you're finding x-intercepts, you take your expression and you set it equal to 0. All right, so this quadratic is in standard form. All right, which means it doesn't have that perfect square factored out. It's just ax squared plus bx plus c. All right, when it's in standard form, the first thing I'll try to do is factor it. Because if I can factor it, the problem normally goes by pretty quickly. If I can't figure out how to factor, if I spend probably more than a minute trying to figure out those pairs to factor, then I'll just go to the quadratic formula. All right, so that's my thought process whenever I see a quadratic in standard form that I'm trying to solve. All right, so like I said, the first thing I'm gonna do is factor my b value is 8, and my AC value is 15. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give 15 and add to give 8, and that's going to be 5 and 3. All right, so since I was able to do that quickly, I can factor. All right, this one, it's really important you remember the difference. This one has the 1 in front of the x squared, so I can go directly to my answer as x plus 5 times x plus 3 equals 0. All right, so I was able to factor that really quickly, so there's no need for me to do the quadratic formula because this is going to be less steps than the quadratic formula. But again, if you were struggling, if you couldn't find that 5 and 3, there's nothing wrong with doing the quadratic formula. All right. And here, the reason we factor is now we can take these two smaller pieces and set it equal to 0, and that gives me two simple equations to solve from just subtracting. All right, so x equals -5 and x equals -3 would be my x-intercepts for this quadratic. All right, real quick, I'm going to pause the video and just show you the work for the quadratic formula in case that's how you would have solved this problem. And on the bottom here would be if you did it with the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula, again, you start off with the formula. It's always the same, but you had to have it memorized correctly. Plug in everything. A lot of people, when they were doing the quadratic formula in Unit 4, finished here, which I kind of accepted because that's actually the correct answer. But here we actually want to know what is the actual x values for our intercepts, and make sure you fully simplify. We can do this plus or minus is just a shortcut for saying there's two answers. So there's one if I do the plus sign, and one if I do the minus sign. So if I fully simplify those, you see I get the same answers, -5 and -3. So you're not going to get different answers because it's just another way of solving the same problem. But just another method in case you couldn't figure out how to factor. You can always do the quadratic formula, but again, just make sure you fully simplify. All right, here's another one. We want to find the x-intercepts. All right, so again, x-intercepts. Always take our equation and set it equal to 0. All right, this equation is in vertex form for a quadratic. All right, and it's in vertex form. I'd pretty much always just solve with square roots. Because it's in this perfect square thing, I can use square roots to cancel that out. So now I have to remember, how do we solve with square roots? All right, the first thing is to get this part with the exponent by itself. So to do that, I have to add 8 to both sides. That gets rid of the 8 on that side. And now I have to divide everything by 2 to get there. And again, this is always the first step when you're solving with square roots, is to get that square root by itself. Get that perfect square by itself. So now I can do square roots. Because a square and a square root cancel, now I just have x minus 3 on the left. On the right, the square root of 4 is 2. And this is the most common mistake students will make, is write this as the next step. I remember, whenever you take the square root of an equation, in the next line, you have to get a plus or minus in front of that number. So x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus 2. And then I have to add 3. And again, just like I mentioned in the last slide, you want to fully simplify so you know the actual intercepts. So if I do the plus sign, 3 plus 2 is 5. If I do the minus sign, 3 minus 2 is 1. All right, so those are our two answers. Again, if you forgot the plus or minus, you would only get 5, which means you'd be missing one of your x-intercepts. So make sure if you're going to use square roots, then you do that plus or minus whenever you do the square root part. All right, it's only in the next line right after you do the square root, you get that plus or minus. Because some other people would put a plus or minus at the very end, but it happens kind of in the middle of the problem. All right, so those are the kind of ways to find x-intercept. If it's in standard form, the process is kind of try factoring first. If you can't figure that out, do the quadratic formula. You could also just do the quadratic formula all the time. You don't have to do it the same way I do it. And then for vertex form, I'd pretty much always use square roots. It's going to be at least number of steps. You just have to make sure you remember that part there. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. Figure out which form it is and kind of which method you want to solve. And here's two ways of solving the same problem. So if I factored it, I get 4 and -4. I can do the shortcut factoring way, do the quadratic formula. Again, get all the way down to the final answer. So this would probably be the first place you'd get. 2 plus 6 is 8, divided by 2 is 4. 2 minus 6 is -4, divided by 2 is -2. So again, two ways of solving the same problem. You get the same answer. It doesn't matter to me which one you do. I'm just showing you my thought process. I would try this way first, and then that way second. All right, so now it's time to practice finding your intercept. So on the skill check, there's basically one of each type of problem. You have to find the y-intercept in standard form. You have to find the y-intercept in vertex form. That's the one that requires more of the order of operations. Then you have to find your x-intercepts in standard form. That's the kind of factoring or quadratic formula way. And your x-intercepts in vertex form. That's the square root way. All right, so just kind of one of each of the types of problems that we've done throughout this video.